My dad was always singing. He sort of had, I think, desires to be a tenor that never happened. My parents met in the Selwyn Chapel Choir, so they met in Cambridge. And he also played the violin, and he always wished he'd sort of taken the violin further, but he didn't. And he ended up going into, well, he became a priest instead. But so my parents were always sort of singing. As a priest, we were always in church, so I guess I was exposed to choral music from quite an early age. My brother was always singing. So it seemed like the natural thing to do. I guess I didn't feel I really had a choice. It just was, you play the piano, that's what you do age 4. And then I took up the violin, because everyone has to take up the violin. Then I took up the recorder. And then I sort of just discovered that there are so many transferable skills from instrument to instrument, and ended up taking up every instrument I could, except brass instruments. I was banned from brass instruments because my brother played them. But I ended up just playing so many, and I think that has actually helped me as a conductor, because it means that I have some technical understanding of almost every instrument in the orchestra. So I'm sort of slightly more technically informed. I know how to make the violin sound a certain way. I know how to make the clarinet sound a certain way. So I sort of was a rather broad musician, and then I was sort of forced to narrow down a little bit when I went to the Junior Royal Academy of Music. And so I started sort of focusing on the harp. That was my principal study, but also keeping up the piano and the violin. So I didn't focus that much. And then I took up the organ just to throw a spanner in the works. And that was really the thing that pushed me further into conducting. So I was doing a little bit of orchestral conducting at school, which I really enjoyed, but it was when I started an organ scholarship at Oxford. So I was the organ scholar at Magdalen College, which involved playing for 8 services a week, which was quite a lot, and teaching children every morning, which was a lot of fun, if slightly tiring. And as part of that role, we conducted probably once a week, conducting a choir made up of children in the front row and then our peers in the back row, which was it was a challenging experience, because obviously you're working with people who are older than you, or in your year, and you've just been in lectures together, and then you have to be bossing them around. But that was what pushed me into thinking about conducting more seriously, and I discovered I really quite enjoyed it, and then ended up being lucky enough to get this job at Pembroke, which gives me even more opportunities to do that. So I conduct the choir every week, as they sing twice a week, and we do big concerts where I get to conduct orchestras as well. I think Oxford completely changed me as a musician, because I went from being an orchestral musician to a choral musician. And that was quite a drastic change. So I went from playing the harp for 6 hours a day to playing the piano, playing the organ for 8 hours a day. And you're immersed in a completely different musical world. I was the only girl in an all-male choir, and I was the only girl they'd ever had. So that was quite a sort of a different change socially as well. I think it made me a much more confident musician. But I think, in a way, one of the things I like about being in the choral world is that I didn't grow up in the choral world, so I wasn't a chorister. Whereas most organ scholars and conductors, I say most, quite a few of them, tend to have gone through the chorister route. And so they will have a very set idea of how a piece should go based on how they did it when they were a child. Whereas I was coming to all this music almost fresh. And I remember there was a very funny moment when I was playing for a service at Magdalen, and I didn't know how this piece went. And I'd listened, I think I hadn't listened to it, and that was a problem. And I'd learnt it half speed, just because I'd never heard it before. And they all said, "How do you not know Dyson and F?" And it was just because I hadn't sort of had that opportunity growing up. Aside from doing things at the wrong speed, which I now don't do, I always check the tempos first. But aside from that, I think it means I can go in without sort of a set interpretation already in my head from someone else, which is quite refreshing. Okay, so obviously it's mainly the chapel choir who I'm working with here. But then we do this big concert once a term, which involves bringing together either an orchestra or a small chamber ensemble. And I love that, because it means I get a chance to work in a completely different way. I mean, choral conducting and orchestral conducting feel very different. And when you're sort of combining the two with a choir there, but also an orchestra, it's quite a challenge, and I enjoy that challenge. So we did the Bach John Passion last year, and we're doing Fauré's Requiem this term, and then we're going to do some more Bach later in the year. So it provides a slightly more versatile form of conducting than what we do in chapel most of the time. And it also gives me the opportunity to get sort of deep into a piece, as opposed to the sort of Cambridge way of doing things where you're just trying to get the music out every week. And it can feel a little rushed occasionally. I love Bach. I don't think any organist can say they don't love Bach. Obviously, I'm doing choral music, which we tend to do sort of Stanford, Mendelssohn, some Bach, some Bird. It covers a whole range of eras, if that makes sense. But I think the thing I really enjoy doing, which sort of links into being a conductor, is training children. So it's something I started doing at Magdalen, and I've kept on since I came here. So I work with the King's choristers and the John's choristers, and teaching them about singing and how to sort of appreciate music is an amazing thing, because you realise that looking forward 10 years down the line, they're going to be relying on that training, and it just becomes an everyday thing for them. It's not a big deal, but they can sight read better than most undergraduates. And I love that. I love that sort of the feeling that you're helping shape someone's musical life, I guess. It varies so much depending on what you're doing. If we take as an example the John Passion, that was something I basically started preparing a year in advance, because I did have the luxury of time. I knew I wanted to do this performance. So I started with just taking the score on a train or a bus and just sitting there and going through it and starting to mark it up. I guess you listen to recordings. You try not to be influenced by recordings too much, but you do listen to them, and that helps it sort of get stuck in your head. And a lot of playing it through at the piano with any arias. You sing them, which is always quite amusing when I try and sing sort of baritone arias. But you sing through them and you try and learn them. And you try and get them to a point where you could perform them technically, even if you're the wrong voice part. So you have really thought about how you think it should be performed. And just making sure that it's essentially all you can think about, I think. With the John Passion, it was just going round and round my head for about a year. And I haven't listened to it since, I have to say, and that was about half a year ago now. So that's sort of my initial process. But with the everyday music we're doing in chapel, you have to condense that, so you don't have a year to prepare every piece. That would be ridiculous. But I will get out the score and I will mark up the important things for the choir, so where to breathe, when to take things off slightly earlier to enable that breath, dynamics, tempo, things like that. And I'll sing it through, I'll play it at the piano. And then that tends to happen in the sort of half hour before the service most of the time. If it's a more complicated piece, obviously you plan ahead and make sure it's been looked at. I think it relies quite heavily on trial and error. I mean, it's the same with learning a piece to play sort of on the organ or the harp. It's about practice and just going back to it over and over again. So with the John Passion, I would make sure I was spending at least an hour on it every day, at least in the term leading up to it. And writing things out I found quite helpful, looking at translations. I don't think there's sort of a formal process. You just see how it's going and figure out what you need to do to make it better. It varies. I remember I used to think about playing it on the violin a lot, because that helps you think about sort of pitching and how close notes are together. Now I probably imagine I'm playing it on the piano or the organ. So I think I see the keyboard in my head. But it depends. If it's a really hard piece, then you might picture it to help you get the interval. But most of the time, it's like speaking. You don't see the words when you read them, obviously, but you're not imagining anything else. There's no sort of, I don't think there's much of a process in between. It just, you see the words and they come out. It's the same when music becomes as fluent. It is a language, so it becomes that fluent and you don't think about it anymore, unless it's a really difficult piece. I write little notes to myself, which can make me laugh in the performance sometimes if they're not particularly clear. So it tends to be thinking about gesture and thinking about, at the most sort of basic level, am I going to be in 4? Am I going to be in 8 if it's slightly slower? Thinking about where they're going to breathe, and then it's about showing the orchestra where the singer is going to breathe so that they can be with them there. Again, dynamics. A lot of it is thinking about joins, particularly in a piece like the John Passion, so it's sort of continuous. So thinking about how you're going to go from one movement to the next movement. You have to get your brain into the new tempo. So you have to, I often find I have to write something to myself at the end of the previous movement to push my brain into the next one, if that makes sense. And then thinking about whether you do want to break in between movements, to give them all a little bit of a rest and to give the audience's ears a rest, just to take sort of 10 seconds, or whether you want to plough straight on. So there are all these different things to consider and write in. It means the score gets quite busy. I think it does change a lot, because I think when you first go into a piece like that, you'll have a very clear idea of it that's not your own, because it all come from listening to recordings all your life. So the John Passion is a piece I've been listening to for years, and you suddenly realise why conductors might do certain things. So you take a little bit of time there because it allows the singer to breathe and it allows the instrumentalists to breathe. And so you realise the reason behind things, as opposed to just thinking that's how it goes. And the more you get to know the piece, the more you think, actually, we could breathe there instead, so they don't need to do that, or we could take this a little bit faster. And then it also varies a lot depending on the space where you're going to be performing. So, for example, if we are performing something in here, there's not much of an acoustic. It's quite dry, or relatively dry, and it's a pretty small building. So we tend to do things slightly faster, whereas if you were doing something in King's Chapel with this huge acoustic and a huge building, then they do things slower because the building needs time to breathe. So there are all these different considerations which mean that every interpretation of a piece can be completely different. I remember walking to work and I wasn't listening to it, I just was singing it sort of in my head, and I think people gave me very weird looks, and I suddenly thought, oh, we could do something slightly different there, and I sort of ran the rest of the way to work so I could write it in my copy. So there are things like that. I don't think they happen as often as people expect they would. But that just comes from getting to know the piece so well that your brain just starts to sort of work on it even without you thinking about it. It allows you to let your perception of the piece change. In the same way as if you look at an essay you write in your first year of university compared with an essay you write in your second year of university, they'll be completely different because you've had more life experience in that time, you've learned more about writing essays, you've learned more about your subject. In the same way, if you're studying a piece over the course of a year, you will be living life partly through the lens of that piece, in a way. You're walking around, I walk to work and listen to the piece. And so you might suddenly start associating one movement with the time you nearly got hit by a car or something, I don't know. But it means that the piece sort of becomes one with you in a way that it doesn't if you're just looking at it for sort of a day before. I mean, I don't think anyone would ever attempt to do the John Passion in a day, because that would be ridiculous. But yeah, I think that is the difference. It becomes part of you and you just know it so well that you don't have to think about it. There are millions of recordings, and everyone will have a favourite. And I guess that's the thing that keeps you going, and you think, well, actually, this could be someone's new favourite. Everyone has a different personal preference. So yes, there is this sort of weight of history, but I just like to do it the way I think it should go, which sounds very selfish, I guess. But it means that you don't get bounded by historical accuracy necessarily. I think because of the music making I'm doing, which is for a sort of a choir who sing sort of semi-professionally but for enjoyment more than anything else, there are groups where they're preoccupied with historical accuracy, and I think that's a brilliant thing, but that's not what my group do. And so I just like to sort of make sure everyone's enjoying it. I think that's, for me, the most important thing. There are elements of historical accuracy that you have to consider, and you have to research a piece thoroughly, but ultimately it's about enjoyment, at least for this choir. I think we're at a stage now where in classical music anything goes, in a way. People are trying to do things differently in order to make it more accessible to more people, which I think is brilliant. I mean, obviously I don't think that we should do the John Passion with electric guitars or anything like that, but I think there is a lot of freedom, and there are so many decisions to make that are before the stage of getting electric guitars, that you feel that there is a lot of freedom within that, even if it's in the sort of boundaries of what is appropriate for that certain piece. It's difficult. I mean, there are some things which I think are ridiculous, such as sort of dancing off stage after a piece. That seems silly to me, but that's just because of the sort of concert culture I've grown up with. So I guess there is a sort of subconscious limitation, but not something that worries me. I act very differently when I'm conducting, in that I feel a little bit like it's putting on it's acting. You're putting on a role or entering into a role. For example, I find I can't really conduct if I'm wearing a dress. I just feel wrong. And I guess that's something that came out of being in a completely male world at Magdalen. And I just found that people treated me slightly differently if I turned up wearing a sort of tailored suit as opposed to if I was wearing a pretty dress. Just because it felt like a bit of a disconnect for them. And I think that's something that's taken me a while to get used to, but now I guess I've sort of almost melded with that because it has just become my way of life, and that is who I am now. And I miss the pretty dresses a little bit, but it's, I think there is this thing of sort of standing with power and authority, and that a suit helps you do that. It shouldn't be about how you dress, but for me, I find that helpful. And then I think you have to prove yourself in any conducting job. I think perhaps it can sometimes take a little while longer for women to prove themselves, but we're getting to a point where everyone is aware that there is an issue, that we need to get more female conductors, and everyone is aware that female conductors are no different to male conductors. It's just trying to balance it out. I was looking up organ recitals and saw that sort of out of the next 100 organ recitals, 4 were given by women. And it's not that they aren't out there, it's just that they don't get the same exposure. So it's trying to even that out. And you get used to it pretty quickly, and I don't think it affects my conducting anymore. But I do feel I act differently when I conduct. Well, I think I speak with a deeper voice. I think my voice has got deeper since I started conducting regularly, because it helps bring sort of authority. And it sounds so stupid to say that. I guess it's also got deeper because I have to sing lower to demonstrate things. But if I had spent my whole life going, oh yes, and now we're going to do this, it just doesn't sound the same. Whereas if you say, okay, we are now going to rehearse this, this, and this, people think, okay, that's what we're going to do, and they don't sort of react in a negative way. It relies heavily on bouncing off the choir and seeing what they give me. So as a conductor, part of your job, in fact, the main bit of the job is bringing the energy, I think, and pushing that energy onto a group of people. So they can be singing together and it can sound fine, but it can have no sort of drive. And so you have to stand up there and show them that drive. So show them the breath and then show them how to sort of put it across. So I think energetic is definitely one way of describing my style. I've been told I dance quite a lot when I conduct. I sort of lift off the ground, which people find amusing, but it means it gets this quite light, buoyant sound, which is the way I like it, as opposed to being quite sort of strict. But again, it varies from piece to piece, and depending how the choir is singing on a certain day. Part of the joy of playing in an orchestra is fueling your artistic sort of thoughts into someone else's vision. There is still room for individual expression within a sort of overarching idea. And I think that's the job of the conductor, is in a way to take all those ideas that could be completely disparate and convince them to follow that big idea. It depends on the group of people. So when I start rehearsing a piece, I always just let them run it a couple of times so they get used to how it goes. Sometimes I'll play them a recording if I think there's a particularly good recording they should listen to. Essentially, it's trying to familiarize them with the score, particularly with something as difficult as a John Passion. They have to get to know it really, really well before we start working on sort of the nitty-gritty. And then a lot of it is, you obviously try and show quite a lot through gesture. I talk quite a lot about metaphors, so trying to, I guess, put a picture into their head, going back to what we were talking about earlier, putting that picture in their head that they can then transfer onto the music. I think they find some of my metaphors slightly weird. It's sort of octopuses walking down streets and things like that. But and trying to keep them laughing is a really important thing for a choir, because it keeps their voices nice and free and keeps them happy as well, which is important. But yeah, so I think it's a mixture of gesture and imagery. The difficulty is that for me as a musician, music represents those emotions. And so the music at that point in time is the thing I'm thinking about that perfectly encapsulates that emotion. Does that make sense? So whereas some people might rely on sort of images, music provides that for me. So it sort of just makes sense that the music stimulates that emotion. And if I'm feeling sad, I might listen to that piece of music. It works both ways. So yes, I think it's the sort of music just fills you, essentially. I guess it does go back to this thing of energy, and you have to essentially try and feel the emotion in order to get it across. So we were doing a piece when we went on tour to Zambia. We're doing this piece, Deep River, and it started off as something which I was sort of just thinking it's quite a sad piece, and I would get a little bit emotional, and then the choir would sort of respond to that and sing it in this very emotional way. But then it got to the point where by the end of the tour, they couldn't sing it without bursting into tears. And I was the same. I would give the notes and I would start crying instantly. So I think you have to be slightly careful that that doesn't happen. It becomes a sort of perpetuating thing. But yeah, you do have to really feel the emotion of a piece before you conduct. And I think that's why conducting is so exhausting, because you go through this roller coaster of emotions, again, with the John Passion. It's draining, it's emotionally draining. And you come out of it and you sort of feel like you need to sleep for a week. But that's part of what makes it so fun, I think. If you realise that something isn't working, you have to find a different approach. And occasionally that can be difficult. You can feel like you've run out of options, in which case you leave it for a bit, go on to something else, come back, and often you find that the problem has sorted itself out. If not, hopefully you'll find another way to go about it. A lot of it is dealing with personalities. It's a sort of exercise in reading people. So you have to realise if they suddenly lose their concentration, you've got to do something about it. It's an exercise in people, essentially. And keeping everyone happy, you've got to think about who's got the solos, if you've evenly distributed the solos, if people are standing next to their friends, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's very sort of political in a way, which can be quite challenging. And then you get people sometimes wanting to swap parts, which can be challenging when you've sort of planned a choir around who is going to be singing where. But it always settles down as soon as they realise the sort of protocol. The first couple of weeks of term can be a little bit difficult, trying to keep everyone sort of happy and at the same time let them know what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And yes, occasionally I think you get people saying, oh, well, I usually take a breath there. And if it's a soloist, obviously as a conductor, you tend to listen to them. And there are always discussions that go on between soloists and conductors to try and unite those visions. But there don't tend to be that many problems with orchestra members sort of revolting over differences in ideas. I mean, I guess if you turned up and conducted Beethoven 5 at 3 times the speed it usually is conducted, people might kick up a bit of a fuss, not least because it would be pretty difficult to play. But there tends to be a sort of assumption that the conductor's idea goes, at least initially, and then the rehearsal process is sort of a musical dialogue. And I often change things if I find, for example, that I'm sort of going through in between 2 phrases with the choir and it just doesn't sound quite right, then you can change it, and that's fine. And I guess that's the dialogue in a way. And that goes beyond what sort of sounds nice and also just what they feel works. So if they turn around to me and say, actually, I would really like to do that, I always try and listen because they are the ones singing it. I'm just waving my arms around. I mean, I wish I could say, oh yes, I sort of eat 3 bananas and do 10 star jumps, but to be honest, it tends to be a logistical nightmare because you're juggling rehearsals. So for the John Passion, it was like organising a battle. I had this huge spreadsheet with who had to be where, when. We had to spend the morning moving furniture over to the church, setting everything up, spending the afternoon rehearsing, but it's sort of quick fire rehearsals. So it tends to be rather hectic. And then you get this hour before the performance, which is this dead hour, and that's always a bit I hate because there isn't really much you can do except sort of look through your score, write in any notes from the rehearsal you might have, try and recap, but it tends to be a very, very slow hour. I think I used to have more rituals when I was performing as a sort of practicing musician. Well, not that conducting isn't practicing, but as a harpist, for example, I would always make sure I had a banana before performance because you don't want to get hungry. That isn't, I don't think about it in quite the same way with conducting, because I guess with playing the harp or the organ, you're very concerned about making sure you're not shaking. With conducting, I don't tend to shake because it's a different process. So my hands used to tremble a little bit, particularly if I'd had too much coffee. So I don't drink coffee if I'm going to be playing later. Or if I got too hungry, I'd start shaking. So I think it's a slightly different process preparing for a playing performance as opposed to preparing for a conducting performance. The thing you try not to do is think about the thing you've just done. That's the first step, and that can be difficult, particularly if there's a slight mistake. It's very easy for your brain to dwell on it, and then you go into autopilot and are thinking about that. And that is really obvious to the audience. They can tell, and the orchestra will tell when you go into autopilot. So it's about trying to keep in the moment, and then your brain just has to work very quickly when you get towards the end of a piece, and you start just thinking about what you're going to do next. But that's where rehearsing individually as a conductor is important, because you practice the gestures of stopping a piece and then doing that and then carrying on. So you know what you're going to do, hopefully so well that you don't need to think about it too much. I think one of the things I love about conducting on the night is you're not thinking about listening out for mistakes in the same way as you are in a rehearsal where you're wanting to fix things. On the night, you can't fix things, so it's about making the sort of musical ideas as cohesive as possible, and it just becomes about enjoyment and sort of trying to put that across to the orchestra and the choir, because then it will go out to the audience. So there's a lot of smiling, a lot of grinning at them. I always love the performance, and the rehearsal process can be very stressful, but there's nothing better than standing up there and then hearing it sort of in full for maybe the first time or the second time. It's a wonderful feeling. I try to never think about the audience. I just sort of pretend they're not there. I like it to be a dialogue between the conductor and the orchestra or the choir, and then hope that that comes across to the audience. Obviously, sometimes someone will cough, and then you get pulled out of your little bubble temporarily. You try not to, but it can be distracting. With nervousness of performers, when it comes to that, I always just try and smile at them as much as possible. For example, we did an Advent service here a couple of days ago, and one of the girls was a little bit nervous about singing her solo. So I just sort of smiled at her for the whole thing. And even if they make a mistake, you just keep smiling. And it's about being kind of a little bit deadpan, but being like encouraging and just saying, this is about music making, it's about enjoying yourself, just try not to worry about it. Size of audience can actually be problematic in the opposite way to what you expect, in that if you put 200 people in here, for example, the acoustic dries up. So we might have rehearsed something at a tempo which works in the normal acoustic, but then it suddenly feels very different. So things that you can sort of have to respond to the room in that sense. If you have a tiny audience, it can be that I have to work slightly harder to keep the sort of morale high within the group. If you've only got 3 people, I mean, it's never happened, but if you only have 3 people in the audience, you would have to be very positive in the conducting to keep them sort of thinking, actually, no, we're performing this. It's not just about the number of people, it's about performing to the people who are here. Yeah, acoustic is a big one. I think that's the main thing we consider, and the size of room. And you have to just get used to going into a space and often only having 2 hours to get used to it and getting used to a different way of singing. It can be disconcerting. When we took the choir to York Minster, the front and back row couldn't hear each other, and they're not used to that because they can always hear each other here. So they have to get used to that and find ways around it, and that's as much them as me. It comes and goes. It can feel a bit like a dream, and you sort of think, wait, I remember starting it and I remember finishing it, but I'm not entirely sure what happened in between. It depends on the length of performance. I do find, the thing I learned when I did the John Passion is that the thing that pulled me out of my kind of music brain was the fact that my feet were hurting, because I'd made the mistake of wearing heels that were slightly too high, and I'd worn them for the rehearsal as well. And they were heels I wore every day, but when you're suddenly standing on one sort of bit of ground without really moving your feet for 2 hours, it really hurts. And that pulled me out of it. And so that's something I learned for next time, keeping your brain in the space by making sure you're as comfortable as possible. It's difficult. It just happens. Occasionally all the sort of stars align and everyone just suddenly locks in and it's brilliant. And you hope that happens as much as possible in a performance. I mean, I found it happened in the very first chorus of the John Passion. And I think because the whole choir just grinned at me and there was this feeling of, oh my gosh, we've got an orchestra, we've got a massive audience sitting watching us, and you just felt this kind of enthusiasm for it. So you do get that, and I think I've had it more with orchestral playing than I have with choral music because I think you're working with more people in a way, and so there's that sort of mass enjoyment. I mean, when I was in the National Youth Orchestra, there were 165 of us, 5 harps, and I used to just get goosebumps the whole time because it was so loud, and feeling the kind of collective breath and the collective movement of the orchestra is just completely magical. I mean, where else do you get people moving completely in sync and thinking completely in sync with that many people? It's an amazing feeling. If circumstances push you in that way, sometimes, if, for example, you realise that the singer is struggling a little bit, the soloist, then you might slow it down a little bit, do it slower than you'd expected. You have to be prepared to respond to the situation as it happens at that point in time. So things can change a little bit, and I don't know, sometimes you might find the flute doesn't come in, and so you have to add an extra, like the whole orchestra adds an extra bar, and then the flute comes in. And that has happened. I mean, it's terrifying. That is the terrifying thing as a conductor, because obviously we can do what we can, but we can't play their instruments for them. So if someone misses an entry, it's, oh gosh, and you have to just try and be as clear as possible and help them find their way back. So things can change, whether intentionally or not intentionally. But you hope that what the rehearsal has done is brought together that sort of collective idea of how the piece goes. So even if something does go off the rails, it can find its way back. They probably wouldn't add a bar, but they might just take longer at a pause, for example, and then collect together. And so you'd be very clear, and you may I often put a finger out and just say, so everyone realizes something has happened. And then you can carry on like that. And so it's trying to find, it's very much thinking on your feet. And that can be really quite scary because it has the potential to sort of derail the piece a little bit. But they don't tend to be huge disasters. I should be more aware of what I'm doing with my face. I know I pull some very bizarre facial expressions. It's interesting because with the choir, there's this sort of dilemma. Do you mouth the words? Do you not mouth the words? I know I often breathe with them, and occasionally I can sniff with them, which can be really helpful if it's a sort of difficult entry, although I always try and avoid it because obviously the congregation can hear it. And then you try and mouth words for sort of important moments to help sort of with emphasis. But with orchestral conducting, you sort of focus on your hands and you hope that your face brings the excitement, if that makes sense. So with the choir, I'm often talking about raising their eyebrows because it helps keep their, sort of in a convoluted way, it helps them raise the soft palate and keep a lot of space so they sing, hopefully, more in tune. So I often am going like this to them, and I look like an idiot, but it works because they all go like that back, and then they sing with a much brighter sound. I mean, it's a weird feeling because it's sort of ecstatic joy at having finished it, slight sadness at the fact that the project is over, and it's something like with the John Passion, it was a year's work, just done in 2 hours, or just more than 2 hours. So that's a very bizarre feeling, and you're on this weird sort of cloud nine, but also feeling quite sad, very tired. I always try and mark in any comments I have in my score after the performance as soon as I can. So if, for example, a join didn't work quite as well as I wanted it to, I write that in so that I remember it for the next time I do the John Passion, and I want to look back and I see, oh yeah, I need to actually do 2 beats there instead of 3. And that can be quite difficult to do because obviously you want to just go and sleep or go and have a drink with the choir or something like that. But trying to sort of write down any reflections as soon as you can is something that I think is very important. But it's this amazing sense of kind of happiness that tends to come after a concert, and there's this collective joy at what has just happened. It's an amazing feeling. I think I took 1 day off after that. I just couldn't listen to the piece for quite a while after the performance because it had been everything. It had been my entire life for that, at least for the term we were preparing it. I had been living the John Passion, I'd been breathing the John Passion. And to hear it again, I sort of, almost traumatic memories, but in a positive way. So yes, I think a musical break, just doing something completely different. I think I went and played some Rachmaninoff on the piano instead to just get Bach out of my head for a bit. And then you gradually work your way back in. So it's a weird thing. I guess it's almost like you're in a relationship with a piece and then you break up with the piece and you have to sort of give yourself that time, that adjustment period, and then you go back into it. Well, I welcome feedback of any kind. It's always nice to be told that was good, but I always take that with a pinch of salt because I think a lot of people can sort of say everything is good. And so I actually prefer getting constructive feedback. So for example, there's someone who always turns up to chapel who was a conductor, and he will always say to me, oh, you could work on not doing that. For example, if I'm wearing flat shoes, because I'm so used to wearing heels, I tend to go up on tiptoes. So when I bring the choir in, I go up onto tiptoes to do that. He says, oh, you should try and ground yourself more. And it's really useful to have someone who is watching you without trying to judge, just thinking, what can you do to improve? And similarly, when I watch videos back, I'm often like, oh my gosh, I never realized I did that. And that can be a really productive sort of learning process, watching videos of yourself and critiquing them. Occasionally you get really annoying people who turn up and say, oh, I think you'll find in bar 5 of the Sanctus, you should have taken them off a beat earlier. And it's just like, really? But that's part of life here.